Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 19 of the Late Stage Podcast, and I'm your host, Sinan Schwarting, live from New York. Again, hiding behind the mic here. For anyone who's seeing me on camera, I just flashed another Knicks jersey. My third different Knicks jersey in only 19 episodes, so this is becoming a theme. There's a logic here, though. This is, of course, the final day of the New York Knicks this season, having failed to make the playoffs once again, just like the good old days. So there's some normalcy returning to the world. The Knicks suck again, but I'm just repping them anyway because I'm a fan, big fan. What can I say? And shouts to the dude on the back, Derrick Rose, who sort of the missing piece this season. For anyone who doesn't know. Let's focus on the news, shall we? Of course, on the pop culture front, right? The NBA is winding down, and that's what I'm doing here with my classic edition. But yeah, tons going on in the world, of course. Not just in the news, right on the entertainment front, and in various facets of the world, but let's focus on the news, because that's what we do here a little bit, right? First of all, shouts. Last week, we did a huge episode on Yemen, which was, I hope, informative, I hope educational, but certainly rife with controversy. It's a controversial topic, I think, and folks get real riled up about it. I had people who just didn't like the politics of it. Honestly, they wanted me to be more critical of the U.S. or less critical. It's funny how it vacillates between two camps. One side saying it's entirely the United States' fault, and another side saying the United States isn't to blame at all. This is a Saudi Arabia thing. We're just supporting an ally, right? And so somewhere in the middle, I think, is the truth. I hope I fleshed that out a bit last week. One sort of special note, I guess, a correction of sorts. Not exactly a correction, but so Dara Hensey, a friend from elsewhere, mentioned, he'd asked, like, oh, you didn't mention Ali Abdullah Saleh. Saleh was, of course, the first president of Yemen and a supporter of the Houthis. In fact, I had done a little segment on that, but I had to cut it. It was already an hour-long episode as it was. So I had to cut little bits and pieces that were like less central to the bigger narrative, the bigger picture there. So not just Saleh, there are other points. Another thing he'd asked about, and he's right to ask about, the United States had essentially already acknowledged that Al-Qaeda was doing them a solid by, effectively attacking the Houthis, in some ways more effectively than the Hadi-led forces. So there's this sort of dual reality, which is that on the one hand, the U.S. had been there before the Civil War conflict, for this sort of like, we're getting rid of Al-Qaeda, motive. But then as the conflict erupted and they were still there with their ability to drone strike, right, that was moved towards attacking the Houthis so that they could help their allies regain control of the area. And so, I had sort of meant, in some ways when I was talking about the United States and their optics or what they were sort of actually doing there versus what they claimed to be doing there, that a lot of the Al-Qaeda stuff was stuff the United States was claiming to be there for, whereas in reality, they were helping the Hadi-led forces fight the Houthis far more than they were doing anything about Al-Qaeda, especially once the conflict, the Civil War, really broke out and the Houthis had major successes. A couple points, right? Like mentioning the support of Saleh to the Houthis is significant because Saleh was the first Yemeni president. At the very least, it underscores what I was hinting at in the episode about how Yemen must have significant popular support for them to have so quickly and effectively taken over such important parts of Yemen. So, yeah, you know, at the very least, it underscores that point, right? If a major figure in Yemeni politics, in Yemeni history even, who's siding with the Houthis, and actively so, you know. So, anyway, let me move on. So, these last few episodes, right, there's been a ton of Europe and Ukraine, of course. And there's, obviously, we did Yemen last week. And I had talked about Congo for a couple episodes in a row now. So there are a few places that have been given short shrift. Asia, we talked about the South Korean elections and the solar panels, right? Some green energy, good news talk a couple episodes ago. But so the one area that's really been not given enough attention of late are the Americas. And I think it gives us a good juxtaposition here, actually. So let's move to the Americas. And so the big news, first of all, there's news out of El Salvador. The war against gangs there has ramped up and starting to look like some of the sort of far-right authoritarian responses to it in the past, as well, I mean, which doesn't excuse the gangs themselves who are doing despicable things. That's picked up again after a lull. But it's all kind of undermining Nayib Bukele and perhaps revealing him for who he really was. And then second of all, we're going to talk about Costa Rica and the elections there. Some news in that regard. I think I may have said they were upcoming in my last episode. Maybe not. Perhaps that was just in my mind. But certainly that's relatively important news regionally. And it tells a bit of a story, I will say. An interesting story, even, you know, as far as these blacks go, and perhaps a negative spin on that. But so anyway, without further ado, let's dive into the news. And first of all, we're going to talk about El Salvador. So, the major news story here, of course, as I mentioned, is that Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, is cracking down hard on gangs. It underscores the sort of news that precedes that, which is that gang violence and murder is up again, and especially the murder rate associated with gang violence, which is highlighted, I suppose, by the fact that in the last weekend, there were 74 people killed in 48 hours, which is the most amount of murder in that sort of short amount of time since the 12-year U.S.-backed civil war back in the day in El Salvador, which we're gonna, I think, talk about a little bit, because I suppose it's relevant in a sense. We'll get into that later. So, among the 74 dead, pardon me for not, I gotta read the details here, but so there were delivery workers, commuters, street vendors, shop patrons. I mean, essentially, I guess what we're saying here is that it's just been a spree of terror, largely perpetrated by MS-13, a gang that has been in the news all around the world to some extent. They are famously born in the prisons of Los Angeles, so kind of a product of the United States' draconian war on drugs and the sort of era of incarceration, which we're probably still in realistically, although now we're reflecting on it a little bit more, relatively speaking. But so Bukele, again, I sort of already alluded to this, because there had been a reduction in the murder rates, especially that related to gang violence, Nayib Bukele had trumpeted this as like his big, accomplishment, essentially, that he'd restored law and order, which, should set your peedy tingling spider sense. But so for the crime rate to suddenly elevate as much as it has is obviously undercutting Bukele, but what's, I think, perhaps, or which at least should be hurting him even more, and I think is starting to, is his response. He's instituted martial law. In less than a week, he has disappeared around slightly more than around 6,000 people. So very draconian, sweeping attempts to just like shut this problem up, essentially. The prisons in El Salvador are already famously overcrowded because of gang warfare and this type of carceral response by the government of El Salvador. Rather than explaining, the need for this sort of draconian policy, or like how things are going to get restored in due time, or whatever, a sort of democratic-minded, high-minded leader might say, he has posted images of police brutality on social media and thrown hashtags sort of fomenting it. Oh, excuse me. So, not a good look. Now, what's, I think, lastly relevant regarding the gangs themselves here is that people have long assumed that the relative peace that that he had been trumpeting was a product of him making backroom deals with gangs, right? Actually sitting down, negotiating with them, which in and of itself isn't a terrible thing, although the sort of clandestine nature of it, the fact that people don't know about it, is sort of a problem, if we're going to be realistic. It sets a double standard insofar as there have been attempts by the El Salvadoran government to, or I guess it's just Salvadoran, but yeah, to make these negotiations and to work with these folks to create a lasting peace. And they have historically led to ruin politically in El Salvador. Historically, when the previous government, which was called FMLN and leftist, made attempts to broker peace, it led to their downfall. Essentially, it maybe even brought Nayib Bukele to where he is now. And so what happened was the FMLN, a party that had power at the time, started a ceasefire and peace negotiations between rival gangs, MS-13 being one of them, in 2012. And so, first of all, the media outed this. There's a lot of opposition media in what is a historically very right-wing nation, or right-wing, controlled by dictatorships that have been backed by the U.S. We'll talk about this again later. But because of certain institutions being largely conservative, media, Supreme Court, stuff that had sort of preceded this leftist government, the news didn't get reported in a particularly flattering way. It created divisions regarding people's response. Obviously, people want peace. And I think anyone who wants peace sort of wants negotiations rather than peace created via violence, via state violence, or whatever it is. So it had a split reaction, but this was then further undercut when Barack Obama designated MS-13 as a transnational criminal organization, kind of midway through negotiations, though. Still, however, they got through a first round. And what's important to note here is that there were international observers and like major religious figures in there to broker peace, just to show transparency, to make it clear, like, it's not like this party, the leftist party, has connections to any of these gangs or are friendly with them or sympathetic. So they made an attempt to create this veneer of transparency. But nonetheless, these more conservative institutions undercut the attempt and essentially used this to undercut that party. The right-wing Supreme Court blocked further involvement in these negotiations and then forced the ouster of the minister, who was a key broker between the two sides of this. So it begs the question, that led to the downfall of that party, and as I mentioned, ushered in this era of Bukele and all of that. After a long period where the FMLN was considered a terrorist group and not a political party at all, they'd finally reached this level and gained very popular support in El Salvador, just to be essentially undercut by this attempt to broker peace between gangs, and gang violence being the sort of number one issue there in El Salvador for the most part these days, domestically. So it'll be interesting to see if Nayib Bukele is held to the same standard as the FMLN was, one hopes that's the case. So we have to, I think, just for the sake of context, right? We have to talk about what the role of the United States in all of this is. So I mentioned that MS-13, pardon for New York sound, I mentioned that MS-13 was created in the prisons of LA, but that's not the only connection here. I hope I say this name correctly. Her name is Yesenia Portillo of CESPES, which is a sort of organization committed to the people of El Salvador. So in a quote, she said that for decades, the United States has poured tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into punitive and militarized methods of combating violence and insecurity in El Salvador. And so what we're sort of suggesting here is that Bukele's heavy-handed response now to, since apparently his backroom negotiations have failed, are supported by the United States and have historically been supported by the United States. The United States has sort of funded in the way of millions of dollars this sort of effort to control the gangs of El Salvador in a carceral, right, punitive, right, rather than meeting them at the table and trying to broker peace in that way. And what's interesting is that El Salvador should probably not follow that model. I mean, obviously, aside from the fact that you're seeing people get disappeared and killed, and you're starting to see a sort of level of state violence and martial law, right? The rise of authoritarianism is noted, right? It's also worth noting that El Salvador has a history of negotiations creating positive outcomes. And FMLN, the party I mentioned, is probably the best example. The FMLN was born in 1932 as an uprising, armed revolt against the dictatorships that had plagued El Salvador historically. Before then, the FMLN was named after Farabundo Martí, one of the leaders of the uprising. And this uprising was brutally suppressed in that same year of 1932 in what was called the Salvadoran Peasant Massacre, in which around 30,000 civilians were murdered in what was called La Matanza, or the slaughter. And of course, the slaughter of this uprising and the sort of galvanizing of this far-right authoritarian dictatorship, military dictatorship, would lead to decades of U.S. compliant military dictatorships, right? Of dictators who were very much aided by the United States financially, militarily, to sort of stay in power and keep suppressing the will of their people, as long as they gave them support militarily and guaranteed that communism wouldn't spread in the region, right? I think the big fear for the longest time was that El Salvador could go the way of Cuba or Nicaragua or a number of other states in the Americas that went the way of socialism. So the FMLN started as a paramilitary group, essentially, and would be resuscitated in the Civil War, which I had previously mentioned, 12-year Civil War, which started in 1979 and ended in 1992. It's worth noting that the Civil War was backed by the United States. A military dictatorship was backed by the United States. There was essentially an uprising, again, coming for the government that had preceded a military coup, right? What was his name? Pardon me. Carlos Humberto Romero was coming to power, had just won an election, was under, they had, supposedly people had machetes at the throats of peasants to make them vote for him, So this was a very contested election against a group of sort of consolidated parties, just not necessarily aligned ideologically, but just aligned in defeating the authoritarian dictator, right? But so because of all the furor around the election and the popular support for anyone who was against this dictator, the military decides to step in and create a coup and install a junta to remove Romero, who is technically on their side, who is himself a far-right authoritarian, but to make it more under the control of the military and to prevent an uprising, again, with the fear of El Salvador becoming Cuba or whatever. So this is a stain on Jimmy Carter. He actually, and hesitantly, in fact, but he supported the junta against the people, essentially, of El Salvador, because he didn't want to be seen as being soft against the red menace, of the Soviets in Cuba and all that. That said, Reagan went big, giving nearly $1 billion in military aid to that military dictatorship. Fairly unprecedented numbers at the time. Now it sounds like nothing, but at the time, those are huge numbers. But so in the midst of this revolution that's created, and so in 79, tensions mount because of the coup and the people against the coup and the U.S. backing the coup and a number of sort of right-leaning governments in the region helping that side, and then a number of left-leaning sides, the countries helping the peasants who are revolting. In 1980, the FMLN is reborn to sort of label this group that's against the far-right dictatorship. And so again, you have an armed insurrectionary group. But in 1992, there's a peace accord reached, and the FMLN becomes a political party. And so this is where we kind of come full circle, through negotiations, through essentially peace being reached, right? There was no clear victor in that civil war. Except perhaps, I guess you could make the argument that the people did win, since they weren't murdered. They were allowed to sort of galvanize themselves in the way of becoming a party and having the sort of ability to fight for their rights, their voice, whatever, and that via democratic means. And they would in fact, in 2009, come to power. It would take quite a while, right, for the people of El Salvador to see them as a party rather than an armed insurrection. But it would eventually happen. They would come to power, as I mentioned, but then it would be trying to help these gangs turn the page and become something else, much as they had, which would essentially undercut their ability to serve politically. So, of note for Nayib Bukele, for the people of El Salvador, that history is real. There is a definite history of diplomacy winning over violence. And so you'd hope that that approach towards dealing with this gang warfare would be considered relative to massive disappearances of people, etc., right? It's also worth noting that, the gangs are perpetrating a lot of this violence in the name of sort of showing the government, hey, you can't tell us what to do, right? We're going to murder whoever we want. And so this wanton violence is something of a product of that, right? Of defiance against the government, who's cracking down now against them ramping up their violence. So gangs are stepping up against the government, and their weapon is murder, right? And then the government is stepping up on the other side, and their weapon is carceral punishment, right? Just rounding giant swaths of people and tossing them in jail. So the real victims are the people in the middle, the working class people of El Salvador, who are either getting murdered by gangs or swept up into prisons unfairly. And so what's happening is, again, the grounds for a people's movement, right? It could strengthen the FMLN, you'd think, especially in light of Bukele failing to do what they may have successfully done, if not for right-wing institutions undercutting their ability to do so. So, good luck to the people of El Salvador, obviously. The worst part of this is the aspect of violence going on here, and the victims of it being the people of El Salvador. But yeah, interesting, I think, in light of everything we've talked about. We've been quick to villainize Russia for what they're doing in Ukraine, rightly, because what they're doing is actually, in some ways, very much present in the United States' history, as far as funding violence of the same nature in the name of securing your backyard, and you don't want to allow the bad guys to take root nearby. During the Red Scare, that was communism. Who knows what it is these days? But anyway, yeah, interesting. Good luck to El Salvador, and especially the working class folks caught in the middle of what looks to be yet another terrible struggle between the state and gangs. A little water there. Moving on to Costa Rica. Costa Rica is also another interesting Central American kind of U.S. proxy state, you know, where the U.S. has done a lot of nefarious stuff. But in this case, Costa Rica has largely avoided much of the violence in the region by just being kind of fully capitulatory for the most part. Even to the extent that they, you know, embrace the kind of two-party, you know, they really kind of tried to mirror the United States in a lot of ways. But to no good end, I guess we could say. Because just as you see here typically, I mean, to be fair, historically, the two-party rule of Costa Rica has sort of deteriorated to the point where it's now a multi-party system. Because of there was so much corruption. So the two parties were the Social Christian Unity Party, PUSC, and the National Liberation Party, or the PLN. And it was in 2002 where the Citizens Action Party, which had broken off with Dissident Party, was born and got a little bit of power, and it sort of broke up the monopoly of those two parties. And then in 2006, it splintered even further, and now you have a full multi-party system, which I suppose suggests the failure of the American democratic system in a vacuum of sorts. That two parties does not serve the people. The reason these other breakoff parties were created were as anti-corruption kind of checks and balances, essentially. So for anyone who's unaware of the US political system, it's not labeled corruption, but I don't know what else you could label, like, for example, lobbying, right? Or whatever. But so anyway, the failed two-party system in Costa Rica, not the failed two-party system here, would later create another party, which would go by the name of the Social Democratic Progress Party. Sounds nice. Founded by Rodrigo Chavez, and Pilar Cisneros Gallo in 2018. It would register in January of 2020, and they would run for president, and it would be Chavez, Rodrigo Chavez. It's ironic using the name Chavez in politics of the Americas, post Hugo Chavez, but in this case, it's for a very right-wing populist. And so now let's dive into who this Rodrigo Chavez is. Why? Because he won. He will take office in May. He ran as an anti-establishment outsider and beat the incumbent, Jose Maria Figueres, with 53% of the vote. So barely won. It was a pretty close run. And perhaps the most galling aspect of this is that the turnout was only 57%. So Costa Rican politics, Costa Rican democracy is a mess. And it's another knock, in my opinion, against U.S. incursions. There have been so many cases of the U.S. spreading democracy to the free world, like expanding the free world, right? And freedom is one thing, perhaps. I don't know. I would never defend like the Taliban or whomever. But and on the other hand, I don't know if the United States should be in the business of spreading democracy, given how imperfect the democracy is here. And I'm not a tanky. I want this to be clear. I support democracy. I support democratic impulses. But in that regard, I think we have a lot of work to do here as far as voting rights go, as far as having politicians that represent the people that they're supposed to speak for, right? I mean, there are so many aspects to which our democracy is imperfect and needs to be worked on, so that I think we need to be, in a sense, more reflective as far as how we view democracy. And we need to be more focused on making sure that we know what democracy is for the most. I mean, there's a very active movement on the right here to basically say, well, this is we're a republic, we're not a democracy, and democracy is kind of secondary, maybe even tertiary to what we really want. And of course, this is post-Trump, right? They were the ones who used democracy to go to war historically, the neocons and whatnot. But so democracy is this term that's weaponized by some and then recanted once it becomes convenient. You know, once you have a Trump who's not so fond of democratic norms, you know, so we should not be in the business of spreading democracy. And I think Costa Rica, in many ways, is an example of what happens when we kind of export our model. And so, first of all, the two-party system deteriorated in the historical context that I had already mentioned. And then, in this most recent election, right, 57% turnout, a narrow victory between two candidates that are quite unpopular, which is why the turnout was so low. And here's why, right? The kind of quote-unquote anti-establishment guy who won, Rodrigo Chavez, formerly was a high-ranking economist at the World Bank. So as far as him being an outsider, that's, you know, maybe an outsider to that specific role, but he was very much an insider as far as the politics at large, economics, you know, financial, being at the levers, right, in Costa Rica financially. So it's sort of like a Trumpian version of an outsider. I mean, in some ways, Trump was far more like, he came from reality TV, right? Like, this guy was in the World Bank. He was operating politically, but just on the economic side. So clearly, when he gets to frame himself as being anti-establishment, you know things are not looking good. And here's where things take a turn for the worse, right? So the election was a very close run thing, obviously, right? He only won with 53% of the vote. And so in the run-up, right before the final vote was tallied, he came out and on March 25th signed a statement of intent proposed by ultra-conservative evangelical pastors in which he committed before God to remove gender ideology from public education, review current regulations on abortion, got to put a huge asterisk in that, and IVF fertility treatment, which is, you know, for folks who struggle to get pregnant. So I guess he's like super hardcore on the like, God has the last say, science cannot have any involvement, you know, kind of that tip of things, right? And now he's also promised to allow religious leaders to veto candidates for posts in certain ministries. So he's really capitulated to the far right kind of culture war aspect of things. And what's particularly alarming about saying he wants to review abortion in Costa Rica, already abortion is very difficult to come across. There have only been, since 1971, when it was made legal, there were very few abortions. Between 97 and 2017, only 80 abortions were performed, you know, on the record, of course. Many abortions performed in back alleys and in bedrooms, right? And probably because of that, many deaths and all kinds of problems that stem from that, right? But what's worse is that when I say that abortion was made legal in 1971, it's only if a woman's life is at risk from having the child. So rape, incest, you know, all of these other cases, any scenario where a woman wants, I mean, as if those are the only, like, what if a woman just, you know, her contraception failed, or, I mean, there's so many reasons a woman shouldn't be saddled with a child just because, or, you know, what if a dude decided he didn't want to use a condom? I mean, there's so many, whatever. Anyway, point being, it's a terrible system, and that terrible system is what he's promising to review. So what? That means that even if a woman's life is at risk, she should be forced to have a child now? Is that what he's suggesting? Crazy. It's crazy. That doubles as our weird of the week, in fact. We could talk about abortion coming under attack here too, I suppose, but And then here's the like ultra caveat, right? So the dude doesn't even want to let rape victims get abortions. And here's what's more troubling, perhaps. He attempted to kiss a junior employee on the mouth, made repeated sexual advances, invitations to hotel rooms for years. So over 4 years, he did this to 6 different women. And then afterwards, when it was basically brought to light and confirmed, said, my Latino culture was subjectively interpreted as inappropriate. So, I mean, I don't know if he's trying to make the argument that Latino culture is rapey, but I can definitely say that if I said that, that would be racist, right? So he shouldn't say that. And I would imagine a lot of non-rapey Latinos are probably pretty offended by that as a defense for clearly bad behavior. But then also, you know, the idea that you have this sort of rapey dude who is trying to like play to the far right in his, you know, on the culture war side and make abortion impossible, right? Like there's so many red flags being waved at this point that I think we can pretty much put that aside and just recognize that this is a disaster. But so there you have it. 2 U.S. proxy states in Central America with far-right populist leaders vis-a-vis Nayib Bukele and now Rodrigo Chavez in El Salvador and Costa Rica, respectively. A bit of a disaster for the region, certainly a trend. I have noted previously, I wrote an article for the Late State Tribune about how there's a bit of a leftist uprising in South America. You know, a number of states have gone to the left further south. So it's somewhat fascinating to see these trends emerge. You know, the closer you get to the United States and the closer you get to this history of U.S. involvement and neocolonialism and nefarious tricksterism, essentially, the more you see failed states, kind of failed projects regarding democracy, deteriorating projects, former far-right dictatorships turned democratic projects, kind of maybe reverting back, you know, in the light of this new strain of authoritarianism, you know, kind of post-Brexit, Trump, Putin, you know, the like. So it's a troubling time. It's a troubling time that we're living in. Certainly regionally, it's a troubling time. You have 2 distinct camps forming to our south. Here, we don't know what the hell is going on. We don't know who we are. And so, yeah. Good luck to the people of El Salvador with their struggles. Good luck to the people of Costa Rica, who, you know, 57% of the country, and then half of that, so about 25% of the country just decided for the rest of you that you're going to have a far-right populist, kind of rapey, religious conservative quasi-dictator, potentially. I mean, hopefully it doesn't revert to authoritarianism immediately, but there's a trend of it, right? In the country, in the region, as a product of U.S. involvement, backing anyone that was against the commies back in the day, right? So here we are. Anyway, that's all I've got for this week. Again, right, for my weird of the week, I could probably have highlighted the wacky abortion law in Costa Rica, which is now being further undermined somehow. You know, I don't even know how that works. I could talk about, man, there's so many crazy things to talk about. Marjorie Taylor Greene, yet again. Sarah Palin, back, maybe going to become a leader in Alaska. I don't have the energy to do any more bad news this week. I think that's it. But so, yeah, that's it. That's all I got to say. I mean, I'll leave us on a sort of thought, I guess, right? So here we have 2 failed U.S. proxy states that have been basically given to the far right by U.S.-backed dollars for decades that are just struggling with it. And that's one side of an age-old debate, right, between two sides historically, right? In the Cold War, it was the U.S. and the Soviets, and now perhaps the U.S. and China or whatever, right? And I've spoken to my highfalutin ideals that I imagine every region had a voice vis-a-vis blocks, and so that could minimize the role of a China or a United States and make it a more democratic world all around, right? Very idealistic stuff. But so here's a good example of why, right? When you have two states that are either outright attacking people, the way Russia is Ukraine, or they did in Georgia. I mean, there's a fascinating thread. I almost want to just go through it. There's this fellow goes by the name of Maxim Eristavi, and he did this long thread on Twitter of just all of the various colonial projects of the Russians pre-Soviet Union, during the Soviet Union, and it goes all the way from 1920 in Bukhara, goes further back from 1917 to 1932 in Ukraine, or the Holodomor genocide. You had in 1917 to 1920 in Azerbaijan, Russian colonialism, a massacre there in Armenia in 1917. In 1917 through 1924, Georgia tried to leave. They were destroyed. 1918 through 1945, the North Caucasus tried to leave. 1917 through 1921, Bashkortostan. I mean, there are all these states. And you look at Russia on a map, it's this giant thing, and you think, perhaps it was just lots of not particularly populated areas that were just under their control historically. And then you go through this: Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, right? The indigenous nation of Crimean Tatars tried to leave. Zeleny Klin, the newly independent Ukrainian people. Kuban, Cossacks. Idel Ural tries to leave. Belarus, right? I mean, there's just Karelia up near Finland. The Tungus, Republic of Indigenous Arctic Nations, tried to leave Russian colonialism. Yakutia, again, right, going up to the Arctic, up north. North Afghanistan, Tannu Tuva. I mean, there's just in fact, this giant area of land that we think of as Russia was a product of violence and colonialism on the historical side, going back to the Russian Empire, to the Soviet Union later on. And so it's not just the Soviets, it's not just this the communists, right? Which I think was a fun narrative for people on the right wing in the United States to run with. But I mean, Russia does have this somewhat brutal history of expanding itself via violent colonialism. But so does the United States, right? You look at, New Mexico is in the name still, right? Because it was land taken from Mexico. The United States did very much the same thing, which is not even to speak to the Native Americans who were just, right, genocided in the name of taking this land. So in both, you look at these giant land masses in the United States and Russia, and I'm sure in China too, right? We know about Tibet and the Uyghurs and parts of Mongolia. There's so many, Manchuria. There's tons of regions there that were likely colonized in the same way. And so these giant nations might not look like imperial states today because they've been these giant things for so long. But the way they were created was very violent and imperialistic, first of all. And second of all, because there are these giant blocks that have so much power economically, militarily, etc., socially, you create these satellite states. And Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Ukraine and El Salvador and Nicaragua and Costa Rica and Cuba, right? Guyana. There's so many examples of people who have suffered because of the United States perpetrating the same type of politics, helping bad guys control their people through violent, brutal repression in the name of, at least they're on our side if push comes to shove in a World War scenario or a Cold War scenario or whatever it is. So this is what is wrong with these super states. This is why they kind of need to be done away with, and why I think blocs like the EU, the African Union, the Eastern African Community that I mentioned last week, the EAC, Southeastern Asia. I mean, there are lots oceanic. The regions need to consolidate and gain power through unity, and not become giant super states that then destroy the regions that they reside in. But countries that work together to sort of align their interests enough that they can defend themselves against larger interests, predatory, neo-colonial ones. So I suppose that's the theme of my episode this week. And I intentionally highlighted, in light of what's happening in Ukraine, I intentionally highlighted examples in North America of what the United States has done historically in the same vein, perpetrating the same type of violence, maybe not to the same extent. Maybe it's slightly apples and oranges. We haven't gone in there directly with guns the way the Russian military did in Ukraine. Whatever. The end result is people dying, people suffering, people not being represented by their own governments that they want to be represented by, and being essentially colonized for the benefits, the economic benefits of people elsewhere. So on that note, I'll leave this there and just say, let's hope in the future we can formulate a better way going forward. With that said, done. Follow us on Twitter at LateStageTrib, TRIB. Follow us on Instagram, Late Stage Tribune. Follow myself on Twitter at Sir_Writes_a lot. Let's go Knicks. Let's go Knicks. One more match tonight, one more game. By the time this episode comes out, it'll probably already be over. But the season will have just fresh landed for us nonetheless. So there's no shame in giving my boys a little support one more time. This is probably the last time I come on air in a Knicks jersey, for those of you watching on YouTube. At least for a little while, right? As we get over the season that's kind of fallen apart to the extent that this one has. Still supporting Besiktas. You can see them over here. For those of you on YouTube, I'm pointing to a little flag that's sort of hidden behind my mic. But anyway, here. But that's it. Because I'm trying to lighten things up here late. But yeah, rough episode. Tough news for the people of Central America, no doubt. And hopefully next week, as always, I will bring better news. But until then, peace out, folks.